Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Medicine for These Times. I am so happy to have back on Simon Yugler, who is one of my, I think, my first few months of this podcast. You were one of my first guests, and here you are. We get to do a follow up and see all that has come about since then. Hi, Simon. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me back, Beth.
This is really going to be fascinating for me also because I've known you since, I guess, way back then, a few years ago, and watched you evolve from, what you were doing then to what you're doing now. And you have this incredible new book coming out. Well, it's available now and on the shelves in October that I think so many people are going to be excited to read, to take kind of a different approach to psychedelic healing. So let me tell people a little bit about you. So Simon has a master's in depth counseling psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. He's also an internationally experienced psychedelic therapist, educator, and author of the book Psychedelics and the Soul, a mythic guide to psychedelic healing, depth psychology, and cultural repair. He's taught for 5 psychedelic facilitator training programs, including Naropa University and Intertrek. And he draws on his diverse experience learning from indigenous cultures, including the Shipibo ayahuasca tradition and the Native American church. For a year and a half, he routinely served as a retreat leader with Myco Meditations, a leading psilocybin therapy retreat center in Jamaica. And prior to becoming a therapist, he served as an experiential educator and guide, leading immersive study abroad journeys for young adults across 10 countries. Based on the land now called Portland, Oregon, Simon is passionate about helping his clients navigate the liminal wilds of the soul. Simon, yeah, let's get into it. I want to hear just, because we can actually link to your old episode to tell your story, but I'd love to just give an overview of what brought you into the world of depth psychology and psychedelics, and to make it really your career.
Yeah. Thanks, Beth. I was fortunate enough to take a psychology class in high school, and the teacher sort of brought us through the sort of early founders of what we call psychology, and we had a whole kind of section on Carl Jung. And one of our assignments was to do a dream analysis on ourselves. And I just remember from that time as like a 17-year-old or 18-year-old being like, wow, this Jung dude is my guy. I like, it just immediately connected, and it kind of, I guess as like a formal interest sort of went underground for a while. But when I was preparing to go to the Peruvian Amazon, I was listening to a bunch of, I guess what we could call depth psychology lectures, and talks with people like James Hillman and Michael Mead, and listened to Jung's autobiography, like the audiobook version of Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And during that time in the Peruvian Amazon back in, I think it was 2015, just really got the clear message that, I don't think it's for me to be pouring cups of ayahuasca and serving that. It just didn't feel like the right thing to do for me at the time, and for a variety of reasons. But what did feel really resonant was all of this depth psychology that had been kind of rattling around in my brain for months, and I kind of began to see, over the course of that month and a half, the ways that depth psychology and Jungian psychology might converge or somehow fit in with all of these kind of more, we could call them shamanic perspectives, or kind of psychedelic perspectives on healing that I was kind of immersed in, in this indigenous context in the Amazon. Kind of had, I guess a vision of like what my path was going to be, which was about converging those two things. And here we are.
Wow, here we are. And I love it. Thank you, by the way, for acknowledging your path was not to be serving medicine back then, right?
Definitely was not ready in any regard.
Yeah. So many people that's become almost a meme of the psychedelic industry, right? You go down to the jungle and you come out a shaman. But that's a whole other topic that we can get into. So let's talk about the work that you're up to now. When I first met you, you were, working at these Jamaica retreat centers, facilitating psychedelic therapy, doing integration work. This was before the kind of like the blow up of everything into, the legal world in Oregon where you live. And then now I'm curious, what were you doing and how has your work changed and shifted into what you're up to now?
Yeah, yeah, good question. I often liken my time in Jamaica to almost be kind of like a psychedelic residency. Like doctors and nurses have to go through a residency program that is really intensive, and they're dealing with sort of like everything under the sun, and it's really immersive and kind of, it's intense. And the point is that they learn a lot really quickly, and that's what Jamaica felt like to me. Just an immersive, intensive experience of really being in the trenches, because that was, like you said, before anything was legal in the states. And so we just got so many different kinds of people, a lot with really intense trauma histories. And so I just worked with a huge variety of people from all sorts of backgrounds, dealing with all sorts of things, on all sorts of doses of psilocybin. So really learned, I guess, that work in a really embodied way, and saw a lot of things that, you know, I think could easily freak most people out, and kind of got through them. And so when I kind of when I was sort of stepping away from that work, and just needing to kind of ground and be home for a while, um, I stepped into teaching, which has been such a blessing. I started teaching with Inner Trek, which is kind of the leading legal psilocybin facilitation training program here in Oregon. So I've been with them since the first cohort, and am a lead educator with them, and have taught with Naropa University, and helped design the curriculum for another training that's no longer operating here in Portland. And just a handful of other programs. I just taught for a Jungian sort of online course or summit or something like that, all about psychedelics and Jungian psychology through an organization called Applied Jung. Um, and honestly, the big focus for the last couple of years, I mean, it's been a 3-year process at this point, but has been the book, and finishing that, and really polishing that, and making that into the best text that I can possibly create. So thankfully my work has like really pivoted towards writing and teaching, and I still do facilitation. I still do, one-on-one work, and I still do group work and retreats, which is such a blessing. So yeah.
Nice. So, for those that are listening, especially if people are newer to the psychedelic space, I want to hear, what is depth psychology about? What is the kind of the gist? And then also, where did the inspiration for this book come from? I mean, I think there was a part of you that just kind of always knew you wanted to write a book, but like, why the psychedelic piece and why depth psychology?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like I said, Beth, like part of my inspiration for part of like one of the big teachings and pieces of inspiration from my time in the jungle was about the convergence of these two traditions. And to me, that a lot of that time was sort of almost like a living example of how those two kind of perspectives on healing can come together. And yet I didn't really see anything out there in the space that reflected that in any way. And I was fortunate enough to go to a graduate school that really emphasized Jungian depth psychology. And so just really took to it and kind of absorbed as much as I could, and really immersed myself in the tradition and feel a part of the tradition, you know. I think in the larger kind of psychedelic world, there's a lot of kind of complexity around culture and like how appropriate is it to take or borrow certain elements of different cultures, you know, the whole appropriation conversation. Depth psychology was created by a bunch of old white guys, and a lot of old Jewish white guys. So it's like literally, I mean, Jung wasn't Jewish, but Sigmund Freud certainly was, right? So there's very much like a sort of lineage that I feel entirely a part of, with zero qualms, you know. So that combined with the fact that I think it's a sort of language of talking about the psyche and visionary states of consciousness and what we could call either sort of spiritual layers of the human experience, or I mean, Jung wrote often about what he called the religious function of the psyche, which is just the fact that we have a sense as humans that certain things are sacred, and we can't really, it's hard to articulate what that is or why that is, but it's a function in our psyche. And oftentimes psychedelics, I think, are so impactful because they remind us of that. And we're like, oh wow, like this is sacred, this is beautiful, this is healing, I feel like I'm healed. And depth psychology makes a lot of room for that, whereas other traditions of psychology actually don't. You know, it's not really a part of most schools of psychology. Um, so there's that, combined with the fact that depth psychology and Jungian psychology, and I kind of use those terms interchangeably, but there's a lot of, I would say, space for what Jung called archetypes or archetypal images, which relate to the collective unconscious. And that entire layer of depth psychology, the collective unconscious and archetypal images and experiences, to me are extremely useful in helping to understand some of the terrain we can find ourselves in psychedelic states. And I think the entire psychedelic experience, sort of the entering into another realm and sort of leaving the known world and watching our sort of normative ways of being slip away and dissolve, right? Ego death, as it's often called. Um, you know, that, and then being in sort of this liminal state of not really knowing where we are, and having, you know, either sort of ordeals confront us, right? Emotions or thoughts or feelings that we have to process and face, right? There's some sort of ordeal or something that happens, or something that is maybe shown to us that we didn't realize before. And then kind of coming back into our normative state of consciousness, and then coming back into our day-to-day lives. All of that, that whole journey is an archetypal movement, you know, and it's sort of, I did a lot of work in my master's thesis on initiation, and that movement is sort of the classic initiatory cycle, you know, that is in rites of passage from all over the world, you know, generations and generations back. So there is an archetypal thread, I would say, that we're sort of touching every time we engage with psychedelic work in some regard.
I love that. I'm like, yeah, that is very true. The exact same kind of arc, right? For the most part, I'm like, well, does that happen with, let's say, ketamine? I don't, maybe.
I think so. There's definitely
Yeah.
like a dissolution
Yeah.
and a sort of floating around in the liminal, and then a coming back together, and you're like, wow, where was I? You know, it's, yeah, absolutely.
True. So this is amazing. I actually have so many questions for you. And I will just note, I just remembered that, what was it, 2 years ago, you were doing a workshop, and I was one of your participants that offered to kind of a processing of a journey that I had that was actually
Right.
one of my craziest experiences of my life. Like I've had a lot of journeys, and certain ones stand out as like, that was wild. And yeah, just to see it from this lens of, okay, well, on an archetypal lens of, that kind of initiation, like, well, what could it be interpreted as, or how do I make sense out of this? Because it didn't make any sense to me. But I want to talk a little bit about the book, and kind of get into the subject matter of it. Was this book written for more of the practitioner or the facilitator and therapist, or the everyday enthusiast, people going to ceremony, or a little of both?
Yeah, a little of both.
Mhm.
The subtitle is A Mythic Guide to Psychedelic Healing, Depth Psychology, and Cultural Repair. So there is an element of it being a sort of guide for people interested in doing the work, or people contemplating approaching the work, or people already in the work and wanting kind of a deeper layer. But that said, it's also, I think, entirely useful and beneficial for people who are just kind of exploring and are maybe just on their own journey of healing, or exploration of consciousness, or whatever, you know. Um, at the end of each chapter, there is sort of a little skill breakdown or takeaway, that is like meant to sort of instill some perspectives and we could say practices or techniques for certain types of facilitation. But it's just as valuable for someone, who has no intention of doing that, because it's working. I'm speaking about different archetypal elements of the psychedelic experience. So each chapter, there's 10 chapters, and each chapter is kind of based on a particular archetype. So the first chapter is called The Well, for instance, and the well is about entering the unconscious psyche, and specifically the collective unconscious, and what that entails, that archetypal process of the descent and the liminal and then the return. There's myths and stories that actually speak to that, just like there's myths and stories that speak to the experience of being in the underworld and descending to the underworld, which is chapter 3. So each chapter is a particular ancient myth that I tell, with the exception of chapter 2, which is one of my personal stories. But um, yeah, basically each chapter is a myth that articulates and sort of fleshes out a particular archetype that I feel has something to do with the psychedelic experience. So because of that, I think it's totally applicable to anyone, right? And there just happens to be these kind of skill sets or techniques at the end of each chapter for those interested or already doing this work in some way.
Amazing. I love it. So then I want to ask about the piece around cultural repair. How does that fit into the book, and how, what is the goal of that? Like, so that, let's say someone like me who, well, I facilitate on some level, but not like a profession, not like a therapist, but someone who's just going to ceremonies or doing their own work. How is this going to help them, contribute to cultural repair, and what specifically do you even mean by that?
Yeah, great question. Um, it's an interesting, that last little phrase, cultural repair, is something that I had a lot of struggle and kind of back and forth deciding on how to frame what I'm trying to talk about. Repair, I settled on cultural repair because the word repair implies that something is broken. And I personally believe, and I think if you've been paying attention at all in the last, I don't know, 100 years plus,
The
uh,
millennia? What
our
are you talking
culture is
about? No.
pretty fractured and broken, and increasingly so. We have this election coming up. It's sort of like each time there's sort of a, I don't know, it just seems like as time goes on, especially over the last 5 years, communities and our culture just seems to become more and more fragmented. And that's extremely concerning to me. And I don't think is a separate conversation from psychedelic work at all. Um, so I think the two have something to say to each other. Um, and I say really early on in the book that I think our world is suffering from two crises that are converging, and psychedelics can kind of uniquely speak to both of these things. One of which is what we call climate change, or basically the collapse of our planetary ecosystem due to, centuries of colonial extraction. So the breakdown of our planet as one collective crisis. And secondly, what is this crisis of this breakdown of community and rituals of belonging, that bring people together, which we could also call a crisis of mental health. So I don't view mental health as a sort of separate, individualized issue to be dealt with just within the individual. There are collective elements to what we call this mental health crisis. And to me, that's a cultural layer. And I think psychedelics are kind of almost uniquely poised to speak to both of these things, because there's a lot of evidence that shows that psychedelic medicines can help us sort of reawaken and reconnect to our planet and the earth. Chapter 9, I believe, in my book is all about climate change and psychedelics and kind of reestablishing a sort of animistic relatedness to this place that we call home. And, woven throughout the book is these ideas of like, how do we do this in community? And how do we make meaning? And how do we sort of establish rituals of belonging that bring people together rather than sort of feed into the divisiveness that we can find everywhere at this point?
Oh, beautiful. I love this. And actually, I want to ask you about this a little bit more because I've been asking guests ever since my very first summit in 2019 about what is the role you believe psychedelics are here to play in the grander scheme of the planet, planetary change, multiple crises, because yes, you named two, but of course we know there's so many more. And I think I personally believe they all kind of funnel back to this deeper disconnection. And like you mentioned, like community connection to one another, like we are inherent in nature that we are pack animals. We're not meant to be on this individualistic capitalist path of, outdoing one another and extraction. But and I do personally believe, and I think most everybody I've interviewed does believe that there's some reason why psychedelics and plant medicines, and even the plant medicines that people say like belong to South America, well, they grow in Hawaii now, or they grow in maybe other parts of the world, and they've certain medicines have really spread themselves everywhere, for better or worse. But what do you think the role is of psychedelics at this time, and where do you think it is heading?
I love that question. I love that question for multiple reasons. One of which is that it's it's sort of the classic question of, do psychedelics have an agenda? Which I just think is a wonderful question. I remember almost like maybe 15 years ago hearing James Fadiman come to Powell's Books here in Portland, maybe even longer. It was right when the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide came out, and he was talking about that question. Um, yeah, I think the last major public talk that Roland Griffiths gave was at the MAPS Psychedelic Science Conference in 2023 in Denver, and he spoke up there on stage, you know, um, about a lot of things. But one of the things he said that I think was, to me, felt like the major takeaway from his talk, the major message that he wanted to impart before he died, which he did, just 3 months later, was the notion that, and this is what he said, psychedelics are essential to the survival of our species. And that's coming from a Johns Hopkins buttoned up scientific career scientist, not a woo woo sort of rattle shaker, but a scientist, And so if Roland Griffiths is going to impart that as his sort of almost like dying wish to humanity, then I'm gonna take that seriously. And he cited a few studies in the context of that statement that I do a little bit of work on in also chapter 9 of my book. One of which is about how I think he got responses from like well over 1,000 people, and it was basically studying how if and how psychedelics help us essentially see consciousness in or ascribe consciousness to what we would call inanimate objects like plants, stones, mushrooms, etc. And what it found was that, psychedelic use, especially long-term psychedelic use, is directly correlated to our sort of recognition of some form of consciousness in what the Western world has called inanimate objects for the last, I don't know, 600 years since Rene Descartes, basically, and since the European Enlightenment, where you know living subjects, thinking subjects, meaning humans, and dead, unthinking objects like plants and animals, became this sort of separated category of existence, which I think is part of the kind of philosophical underpinnings of allowing us to do to our planet what we have been doing, and have allowed, let's say, European colonizers to do to indigenous people what they have been doing for 500 years. It's that line of thinking that psychedelics may actually have some role in being able to slowly disentangle, according to Roland Griffiths. So to me, that's pretty important. And yeah, if there's no other agenda or goal to psychedelics than to helping us sort of realize that we're living on a uh, awake, animate being called the Earth, surrounded by other awake and animate beings that deserve our respect and reciprocity, then to me that's good enough. I think that's a pretty good agenda right there. And I don't make any claims of absolute truth, right? But like it, that aligns with my personal experience. Um, and so yeah, that's what I'll say to that.
Yeah, beautiful. And by the way, I was there at that Roland Griffiths talk, and whew, amazing. And it is funny because I'm as you're talking, I'm like wondering how many people who've worked with certain, especially plant medicines, I wonder how many people have not felt that connection, not felt that kind of inherent knowing. Again, this has kind of become a meme at this point, but like the connection, all things, but it's actually very real, and I do believe that this is one of the reasons it kind of has its, quote, agenda, because it's so needed at this time of like utter disconnection and in this need for repair, as you say. Um, so thank you. And thank you for weaving that into the book. I think you said something at the very beginning that was really interesting. And I guess I had never really thought about, the first time one of the first times I can remember, I'm like, I remember when I was 14 doing my first hit of acid, and that was LSD. Just kind of there was that knowing, like the sacred knowing that there's something else here. And I didn't know what the words were back then. It was like this inherent feeling. And a lot of people report this with, the mushrooms or ayahuasca, where it's just like, how do you put it into words to know that there is a certain like truthiness to the experience you have versus like distinguishing what's not true and what really feels viscerally cellular, memory true. Like, oh, I feel that it's true. I'm connected to something. I feel that it's true that there is a higher power. I feel that it's true that, the earth and all beings and the plants are living consciousness. And, I'm wondering, like, how does one distinguish? Because then there's also the people that come out of some of these things with the truthiness of like, I'm here to be a shaman. Which, by the way, I do like to point out once in a while that maybe some people are truly actually called to be a shaman. I don't know. I mean, it's the large minority. Like, it's not as many people, I think, who get that. But how does one distinguish, like, what feels real and like what might be quote real, and in the end, do we know what is real, in anything, versus like what is the fabrication of the mind? So for example, when I did that session with you, it was like I had this crazy, very low dose, by the way, mushroom ceremony, which I was only supposed to be kind of just like a pseudo helper at. It was insane. And it was like just really dark visions that made absolutely no sense. And I'm like, wow, is this really happening? Like, is this trying to tell me something, that this is something I should be doing? Or is this symbolic of something? Or is this just like, the state of what I was in that day, or the energy, or, who knows, the full moon? Yeah. Do you teach about this and talk about this? Like, how does one know what's really like true versus not?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. And I think what I often tell the people that I'm teaching, and what I would say now is that, like, as facilitators or integration providers or psychedelic therapists or whatever, our job isn't actually to tell people what's true and what's not. So I hesitate to kind of pretend, like, one, like I have an answer to that, and two, like it's my role or job to tell someone what's true and what isn't. To me, it's like the way that I work is kind of always following the medicine, and always following what the medicine sort of reveals for the person that I'm working with. And truth, isn't really up to me to determine. It's more of like what is wanting to unfold, that is in the direction of healing, which really just means wholeness, you know. So like what's serving greater wholeness. And even if that's something really difficult or terrifying, um, I mean, Carl Jung worked with a lot of extremely unwell, what we might call schizophrenic people, early in his career, which sort of formed a lot of his theories on healing and the psyche. And he firmly believed that, like, even the most outlandish, disturbing uh, forms of psychosis and hallucination and whatever are all kind of trying to move the psyche towards wholeness. It might be in a really maladaptive way, but something is trying to get healed. Something is trying to be made whole. So to me, I'm more interested in that than like what's true. Um, and to me, like, truth is almost harder to sort of wrangle, and therefore a little like less interesting than something that has precedence, right? In the sense of, let's say someone has like a really challenging vision of something, but yet there's maybe like an archetypal or mythical thread to it, like the myth of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess, and her descent to the underworld is brutal. It's a vicious, brutal myth. And it's like she's like stripped of all these layers of her identity and her adornments and her sort of garb. She's like literally like slashed in the face by the queen of the underworld and put on a meat hook to rot. And it's like really intense. It's like the most metal myth I've ever read. So if someone has an experience like that, to me, there's precedence for that. There's sort of an archetypal signature that to me is like more interesting than like, is it than the truthiness of it, which I love that word, by the way. I think, is that a Stephen? I think that's a Stephen Colbert.
Is that who I got it
I
from?
think
I don't know.
Colbert coined truthiness, which I love. But um, yeah, like I'm more interested in like, where does it point us? Where does it point the soul? And
Mhm.
like, what is the direction of healing rather than is it true? Although what I will say is, you mentioned earlier, this is kind of a separate question and a separate conversation. So I'll say that, period. And then, you were talking about like, what if someone does have a sort of revelation that they're supposed to be a medicine carrier or whatever? Like, cool, great. My question in that regard is like, have you put in the road miles? Like, have you actually taken the time to learn or apprentice in a way that is going to um, make sure that you know what you're doing, and have sort of systems of accountability and feedback around you? As a therapist, you know, beyond the 2.5 years of schooling, there's like 3 to 5 years of supervision, which is basically you meet multiple times a month with either a group or an individual supervisor to be like, yeah, this is the work I'm doing. This is how it's going. You're checking in with an elder, basically. The whole idea is it's sort of a mentorship built into the practice so that you're not harming anyone, that you're doing good work. And that's a lot of road miles, you know, hours and hours and hours of training and supervised hours, literally to just have a conversation with someone.
Mhm.
So if someone who's called to be a shaman or whatever isn't taking it that seriously and isn't sort of putting in that amount of legwork and time and training, then I would be very cautious.
Yeah.
It's like you got to have some skin in the game. And I think if psychedelics are involved, you got to have a lot of skin in the game, which looks like time, investment, accountability, all sorts of things, right? If someone's just a sort of anonymous fly by night person with an Instagram profile and a bunch of mushrooms, like that doesn't mean anything.
And by the way, this goes for pretty much anything, like cuz I've had this before. Even actually it's interesting. I'm witnessing myself 3 years later after a vision quest. 3 years ago I got a vision during a vision quest, totally sober, where it was like, "Oh yeah, okay, I could see that." And then it was like, "Okay, let me just work with it, get curious, maybe even forget about it a little." And now it's starting to unfold like this much, like little by little by little by little. And like, who knows how many years it'll take. But, and so whether it's shaman, medicine carrier, or really anything, it's like, I always say it's like get curious, but it doesn't mean like go, there's a whole video about what not to do like right after Burning Man. And it's this whole like spoof video on
Oh
like,
yeah,
don't,
I've seen it. It's
yeah,
great.
it's so
Yeah, yeah.
good. It's like, don't divorce your wife, don't quit your job, don't sell your house. And it's the same thing with psychedelics. It's like that's what the word integration is for, right? Or it's partially the word. But yeah, it is fascinating to explore, the depths of what these experiences are, and like the kind of distinguishing between what's real, what's not, how to integrate it into your life and see like, okay, yeah, like one of my friends got that vision and serves medicine, 12 years later, and like very little, with like very specific groups. So it's like exactly you said, apprenticing, showing up, one little moment at a time. But I also want to ask you about you know being in these psychedelic states. And I'm always curious, like, especially as someone who's worked with a lot of participants in this space, I have gotten a lot of like future visions that have shown me like what I would call like visions of the future over years. A lot of these have actually come true. A lot of them I hope don't come true. A lot of them I wonder like, is this real, or is this just an archetype? Is this something that's ancient living in my cellular memory that's showing me like the past but a future, or is this just something way in the future that's kind of living in my cellular memory too, that's never going to manifest in this exact lifetime of mine? Do you ever have people ask about this? Because it's something, again, I have noticed, um not just in the world, but like, it's partially out there in the collective, with a lot of like seers, psychics, people in this field of like, here's what's going to happen in the world. And it's like, well,
Mm.
are we knowing that and then speaking it into reality, or are we all seeing it and then still speaking it into reality? Like, how much of this do we know is just part of this kind of, mythopoetic, like archetypal initiation that we're going through as a collective? Or is it really just like people are seeing, the destruction of Earth or systems collapsing? Or, I mean, what do you think about that?
I mean, one one lens to answer that question through, and again, this is just like a lens, right? I don't claim any ultimate truth here, right? But uh, I think if psychedelics are really, what we call non-specific amplifiers or psychological abreactives, as Stan Groff called them, they're just helping us feel or see kind of what's already there that has a lot of unconscious charge. So I think all of us are carrying a lot of deep fears about the future, and especially about the future of the planet, and the future of, at least if you live in the US, the future of this country. So there's a lot of fear, and I think rightfully so, because we need help, you know. And so experiences like that of, sort of cataclysm and all of that, like, you're already feeling that. But if you were to walk through your day-to-day life constantly feeling the weight of that, you wouldn't be able to get out of bed. And a lot of people actually can't, right? And so, one way of explaining it is just that the psychedelic medicines or experiences are helping you feel what your psyche is sort of organized around not feeling, because it's too much, it's too heavy, it's too sad, it's too full of grief, it's too traumatic to really, really process. If we were to just take a moment, you know, each of us, and like just feel the level of destruction and loss happening on the planet, we would be crippled. No one would be able to go to work. No, everything would stop. People would have to get out of their cars and like weep on the side of the road. If every single person just had literally a moment of feeling that collective well of grief, that's all right there. Everything would crumble. So like our whole ego consciousness is oriented around sort of helping us survive and not, feel a lot of those things, which are collective, which are archetypal. And psychedelics happen to bring us into a sort of collective and archetypal place often. So that's what I would say.
Wow, great answer. And it's always good to remember that yeah, because it's true. Like you said, it'd be very hard to get out of bed. And there are some days where it's like, I mean, there was a point yesterday where I was like, God, do I really need to be here right now? Like, how did I get here? Did my soul really ask for this? I mean, there are those days where it's just so hard to look around and, just be, not just in America. Like mine is like well beyond America. America is like, yeah, it totally sucks. And the bigger picture is so much more important to me. And that's where I personally sometimes have that struggle. But this is where I say, like, if we show up in our hearts and our purpose and what are really, like, what are we here for, and like do the best we can, amidst the grief and chaos and wonder, and that part of our mind that wants to know how things are going to look and how it's going to go, and to release that kind of control of like, at some level I don't know, and that's the human experience. So thank you so much for sharing about that. I want to ask you, you recently ran your first kind of training retreat. Can I call it that? Because I think that's, yeah.
Yeah.
And of course I was like, I should have gone on that. I want to go on one of your next ones. I'm curious, like, how do you teach this and then work with these medicines to then have people learn? Is it kind of like in live interactive, like, like, okay, observe, or is it like, hey, we just go do some work and then come back and analyze it? Like, I'm curious, what do you,
Hmm.
yeah, how's that set up?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. It's I think part of the intention with this retreat was to create an environment where people could learn from the medicine itself and use and work with the actual experience as a teacher, and then to just sort of hold what people are experiencing and coming away with. And I gave like a workshop in the middle of it with kind of things that are harder to sort of learn on paper, right? Like things that are we can't really read about, like because the psychedelic field and space is so highly nuanced. There's so many levels of nuance that you can't really be like, if this, then do that. It's like the opposite of a sort of medicalized situation, right? Sometimes things are like very clearly indicated, but most of the time everything is a sort of gray area spectrum with a lot of emphasis placed on intuition, and that's really hard to teach. So I wanted to be able to create a space where that could be explored and talked about in a felt sense rather than just something you know we're reading about. So yeah, it was great. It was absolutely wonderful. I'll definitely be doing more, if not larger, more longer term offerings in that regard. Um, so yeah, it was great. I had a great time, and I think everyone else had a really really meaningful experience as well.
Now, is this was this kind of training retreat for established therapists who already had a certain level of like background, or was it, could it be someone who's like maybe even new to facilitation who maybe just knows the basics? I'm curious, like, at what level do you have
Yeah,
people
all
in there?
all levels, all
Mhm.
levels. A lot of people who've gone through legal training right here in Oregon and kind of came out the other side and were like, wait, what's next? Like what, how, I know enough to know that I don't know
Yeah.
so much. Right. And that's actually kind of what I've been seeing, uh, here in Oregon, but also with a lot of kind of above ground training organizations where it's like, you learn just enough to know how much you don't know. Or it's like you go through your freshman year and it's like, okay, like what now? Like that was a really great foundation, but where do I go from here? And to me, like the medicine is the best teacher.
Mhm.
And so it's important to me to create opportunities where kind of these deeper layers of experience and training and also just connection, connecting with ourselves, connecting with our community, and connecting with the medicine, can happen in a really beautiful and safe way. Um, yeah, it's really important to me. So that's something I hope to continue doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Someone posted a meme on Instagram yesterday about, or whatever it was, 2 days ago, about psychedelic therapists not needing or not having any actual experience with
Right.
psychedelics, which gets talked about a lot. I will say this, as someone who's been in this world, I have only encountered one person who wanted to break into the psychedelic space who didn't seem to have any experience. But I have encountered a lot of people with very little experience, like very new, like only maybe like 1 year experience, that want to like then jump in somehow, whether it's coaching or facilitation or some kind of combination. What are your views on that? And you just said the medicine is the best teacher, which I also believe. But we do have then people saying, well, I microdose. Do you, yeah, see, I want to hear about this because
No,
that's where I'm like,
no. Yeah. No, yeah. No shade on microdosing. Love it. Do it myself. Sometimes recommend it to clients, but it's 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 not the same. We are not the same, right? It's like I'm sorry, it's just not. And it's not a substitute for deep work. Um So yeah, I mean, the question kind of infuriates me, Beth, to be honest. Do psychedelic therapists or whatever
It's
facilitators
like a
like need
no-brainer.
experience? It's like, do pilots need to fly? Like would you trust a doctor who doesn't believe in surgery or Western medicine? Like, no. I wouldn't trust a pilot who's never been on a plane.
I said
So
it's like a therapist who's never had their own therapy,
absolutely.
which
Which,
is
I mean, also
mandatory.
like there's plenty of therapy programs, that don't require students to get their own therapy. Just like there's plenty of psychedelic trainings that don't require people to get psychedelic experience, mostly because of legal concerns, but to me, it's absolutely inexcusable and dangerous. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And I do want to point out, this deeper work. Like, I personally, as someone who's been working in this space and kind of holding space with others for a long time, it's like, some of my hardest experience or the craziest nights or the person who looks like they're maybe going to die, which they're not, but like it's scary. I've definitely had those, and like you said, working at the retreat centers you worked at, you have stories where it's like it would probably scare some people. I've definitely been in those, and it's like, wow, what great teachers, like, and not always easy, but whether it's with myself or others, some of my best experience was, like, taking St. John's wort, not knowing that it was an interaction with ayahuasca, back in my early days and freaking having like one of the worst experiences. Well, that's how I learned. And then actually a whole community learned and started changing around their verbiage of like, okay, we need to include all these other plants and herbs. So when people say like, oh yeah, I've done like 1 gram or had like one little, MDMA trip here and there, I also agree. It's like you have to learn from kind of going deep into the darkness and, like you said, the work. Um, and I'm wondering, as someone who's out there teaching, how do they, and I do know a lot of these programs build in like ketamine experience or whatever it is, but how do we kind of come into this place of like of being of service as, let's say, a therapist or a facilitator, but maybe they're not ready to go to the jungle and sit with ayahuasca 5 times. Like, what do you really recommend for people? Because I said recently, like, there's kind of no excuse. There's illegal or underground work happening all over the place, to me, it's everywhere, and it's definitely easy to find. But yeah, what is your suggestion for people that maybe want to break into this that have like very little experience?
Get more.
Just get more.
Yeah, just get more. No, I mean, I think I can only really speak to my own experience, which, it starts as a teenager, taking way too many mushrooms to, being fortunate enough to encounter peyote and the Native American church, as like, I think like a 22, 23-year old here in Oregon. And then making my way to the Amazon, the Peruvian Amazon in 2015 as like a 26-year old, and kind of going as deep into that as I could, um, and doing other work right out in the world that helped cultivate me as a human being that was non-psychedelic related, to going to a graduate program, with psychedelics kind of always in my back pocket, to working at a world renowned psychedelic retreat center for a year and a half with people who are my elders and more experienced than me, and learning from them. I learned a lot from a lot of those people that I worked with down there. Um, to doing other trainings, with other medicines like ketamine, to finally like being able to sort of have something to say about it, and help steward others along that path. So all I can really say is like, um, put in the road miles, and it's hard to sort of tell people like where to go or what to do,
Yeah.
because I don't know. That's just my journey. I was fortunate enough to be in a place in my life where I could essentially live out of a bag, live out of a backpack for many years, oftentimes in service to this work, and sacrificed a lot in order to do that. Sacrificed comfort, sacrificed relationship, sacrificed being in my home community, sacrificed a lot of, friends' weddings and like all sorts of things, like there is sacrifice. And I think anyone who kind of wants to sort of pick this up like it's another like fancy little tool for their little toolkit, it's like, no, what have you sacrificed? What are the, like, how long have you been on the road? How many miles do you have? How many road miles do you have under your belt? How much skin do you have in the game?
Mm.
And to me, like, that is what makes the difference, because um, you can't fake that, and it's part of the reason why I think, working with mentors or sort of an apprenticeship model is really essential for this work. It has cultural precedent, in other cultures and traditions, and somehow our culture seems to think that, that's not really necessary, which I think is a huge mistake. So that's what I could say.
Yeah. Devotion to service. And this is where I say, if people get visions, then you have all the time in the world. It's like you can plant a seed and chip away at it little by little by little. But like, yeah, like a, 6-month training isn't going to cut it in the end. It's a really devout path. This is where I personally, as a coach, have actually laid down a lot of boundaries as to who I work with. And there's certain people where I've had to say, no, I can't help you in this realm until you're really, like aligned with my own personal values of like what I believe in. But luckily that's only happened to me once. So that's
Mm.
good. But I'm curious, as someone who's worked in this realm and still working in this realm, where do you see the whole, like, whether underground or above ground psychedelic therapy world like changing? I keep wondering if it's the frenzy is slowing down a little, or maybe the
Mm-hmm.
glamour, like it used to be the kind of this, like, what I would call like glorified, oh, I can just give people psychedelics and sit and watch them and make thousands of dollars. And I
Mm-hmm.
think people realized it's not all that it's cracked up to be necessarily. It's also not a scalable business model, and it's energetically kind of not, it can be very depleting and
Oh
not
yeah.
really fun. But what have you seen out there as someone who's kind of like on the front lines of this realm? And do you think it's going to change in the next few years? Like, where do you think it's all heading?
I don't know. I think what you said, all of that, I totally agree with. And it's basically what we're talking about is like, how do psychedelics and the sort of practice of psychedelic healing, how does that converge with capitalism?
Hmm.
Which is a question that we don't really have an answer to yet. But I would say like not well. It doesn't really converge well with capitalism because of all those things you mentioned. It's not really scalable. It's extremely energetically taxing, or can be. It, requires a lot of sort of investment and time. And then there's all sorts of, prohibitions and legal parameters, and things that are dependent on organizations like the FDA that can undo 30 years of research with a single decision, right? So yeah, it's entirely unknown. But I think there's a part of me, Beth, that is kind of like good, because I think it's good if there's a few things that are kind of civilization can't entirely devour. I think it's good that there's a few things that capitalism can't entirely grasp and contain. And I think psychedelics, hopefully, I really hope, are one of those things. Um, you know, art is really kind of an interesting parallel because art and capitalism converge in really interesting ways. And there's a lot of art that is actually about capitalism. You know, Banksy's famous piece of a thing on a wall at an auction, and as soon as someone bid like whatever $600,000 for it, it clicked into gear and there was a hidden paper shredder in the frame, and it shred the piece basically as a statement of like, you're all like not getting it. And sure, yeah, spend $600,000 on this piece that is now a bunch of shredded paper, you know. And I think the great artists like that, you know, are uh kind of almost like have shown the way for like how this might go. I don't know. The archetype, if we're going to go back to that, right, is the trickster. And I think psychedelics are uh, most closely aligned to the archetype of the trickster, because you never know what's going to happen. You never know how it's going to go. You could take a microdose and all of a sudden you're like, the walls are breathing, you know, and you have to sit down. Like that's happened to me, you know, or alternatively, you can take a huge dose and nothing happens, which has also happened to me. So I believe that these things are archetypal tricksters, and the trickster will not be contained. And any attempt to sort of contain or box in the trickster will always backfire, will always go awry. And um, yeah, you know, and I think that's a good thing. I think we need a little bit of that. Um, and I think trickster is sort of one of these archetypal beings or forces that, you know, especially in the context of capitalism, that wants to sort of just contain and extract everything it gets its hands on. Trickster kind of escapes that, um or like dissolves it, you know. It's like you eat it, and then it's kind of jumping out of you. Like it can't be killed, it can't be contained. And that's my sort of feeling with regards to this. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
I love that you said it publicly because I have actually not responded to the recent FDA non-approval. But I'll be honest, I was like very relieved on some level. And that's just MDMA, where I'm like, well, you know, part of me is like, I don't really care what happens to MDMA. I think it's, you know, it's great for people who need it. But, you know, even the legalization has been such a double-edged sword. And I really wasn't 100% on board with it, you know, even though everybody was like really gung ho with Oregon. But when it came to Colorado, it was like, wait a second here. Like, do we really know what's happening and like how this might backfire? And we've seen various stories of it kind of not playing out the way we wanted it to. And we'll see how it plays out in the future. But, you know, I kind of agree. Like, there's this part of me that's like, well, there's also you know, a widely available underground. Not to say that that's the best solution either, because of course, then we know there's like there's no regulations, there's a dime a dozen, there's a lot of
Right.
chaos in there. But you know, I really do believe in this notion of like cognitive liberty and healing for all and accessibility. So it's kind of like anything, you know, we might have the patented psychedelic that's available to buy at your local pharmacy one day. But hopefully we'll still always have this kind of underground. And then also, not to even mention, you know, then we have like whole other traditions that are ceremonial that belong to certain traditions where it's like, well, wait a second. But I'm curious, like, what do you see happening with the whole underground scene as someone who's also probably worked with a lot of underground facilitators? I personally know we've seen more and more people coming out of the woodworks. There's like, I make jokes that there's a dime a dozen. You know, you can get a mushroom facilitator on every corner now. I also, as a business coach, have seen what I believe to be a fair amount of people realizing that they're not turning it into a viable business, or it's not a sustainable business. And they're also getting into maybe other work in addition. But what have you seen happening to the whole like underground therapy scene?
I haven't really been paying attention that much.
Mm,
I've been kind of so immersed in my own work. I think one thing is just like the outrageousness of what you can find online, and what certain friends and people I know on Instagram are like sort of ironically platforming of like, look at this ridiculous bullshit, you know um healing from healing, right? Like there's just so much absurdity out there. So I mean, that's kind of the extent of the attention that I pay, because if I pay too much attention, it's just sort of extremely concerning and disheartening. So yeah, I try to just sort of stay in my lane, to be honest.
totally.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, Simon, let's hear a little bit about the book. It's coming out. Where can people get it? And how can people follow you? And what do you have planned over the next, 3 to 6 to 12 months?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. The book is on store shelves on October 1st. So even if that's a virtual store, you can get it on October 1st, but you can also pre-order it now, which actually is a huge help for kind of new authors such as myself. It tells booksellers that people want this thing. So if you're listening and this sounds like something you're interested in, feel free to pre-order it. And if you send me sort of like a receipt or some sort of confirmation, either through email or whatever, that you pre-ordered it, Instagram message, whatever, then I'll give you a free month on my paid Substack, which I'm also launching on October 1st. I have a free Substack currently, where I publish for almost a year. It was like every week, and then I just switched to every other week. So yeah, I'll be launching my free Substack, or my paid Substack, on October 1st. And each month we'll have like a group integration circle and things, ways to get involved in that regard. And my Substack is just simonyugler.substack.com. And I would say that's probably the best way. That and Instagram, which I'm sure you'll link to, are probably the best ways to sort of stay up to date on what I'm doing. And the book, I'm hoping to put together a few dates, to do a little book tour sometime this fall or winter. And then, I have some courses in the works that I'll be offering, and of course, future retreats as well. So,
Nice. Yeah, we'll have to have you come out here. Well, Simon, I'm really proud of you, and I'm so excited to see this book coming out. Hosting the retreat. Hopefully, this new course, maybe this winter or spring. This is just really amazing, and I'm so glad you take this perspective and are sharing your unique medicine with the world. And being an advocate for safe and transformative work on the planet. Talking to you, it actually does, there's these days where I'm like, God, being alive is just so hard sometimes right now. But I do have hope, and it is nice to remember, like, there is so much goodness happening through this sacred work that we're doing. Even in spite of hearing a number of not so good stories lately, I do really remind myself that it's the majority. It's like if we can really do this inner work ourselves, and like you said, like our own initiation work or doing our own work, this kind of bigger vision of cultural and planetary repair is, I really do believe, possible. At least that's my deep prayer.
mm,
So
yeah. Yeah. Thanks for saying that.
thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks, Beth. Yeah. This is great.